When I was around 13, my dad gave me some of his old PlayStation 1 games that he didn't want anymore. Among those games was Final Fantasy IX, a game and series that I'd never played before. Along with the game, my dad also gave me the official strategy guide. And then, meaning well, he planted a dangerous seed in my mind as he handed it to me. He said to me, "Make sure you use this guide, because you can miss things in this game that you can't go back for." So, when I picked up the game, I followed that advice. I turned over to the first page of the guide and I followed it to the letter. In Alexandria, I followed the maps to pick up every single item. During the first Black Waltz fight, I used the strategy from the book as closely as I could. And then after playing for a couple of hours, I got bored and I switched the game off. That wasn't my dad's fault. Back then, having a guide was a bit of a novelty because you had to go out and buy them, especially when he first got the game, and he wanted me to be able to take advantage of that. It also wasn't the guide's fault though, and it wasn't the game's either. It was mine. I didn't have to follow the guide one-to-one, I could have just used it as a reference, or not at all. But I am going to cut 13-year-old me some slack, because it wasn't really my fault either. I had all the information I could ever want right there. Why wouldn't I use it? I had no idea that using the information in the wrong way might spoil my time with the game. That was a lesson I would eventually learn a bit later in life. I spent so much time on Animal Crossing New Horizons the first year or so that it came out. So much that I'm not gonna show you because most of you will think that I've wasted my life and the rest will think that's all. Those first few weeks of the game were really fun. Everyone was discovering it together and sharing what they'd found. You'd open Twitter and see someone's funny conversation with a villager, or maybe you'd get a message from a friend showing off the cool way they decorated the outside of the museum. But I, like many others, was drawn in by the siren call of...
Today I'm going to be showing you how to make millions of bells in Animal Crossing.
Animal Crossing isn't a game about money, really. But money, or bells, sure have a lot to do with it. From the very beginning of the game, you're in debt, and one of your major goals is always to pay the debt off. Much like in real life, everything costs money. And even when your debt is all paid off, there's still plenty of expensive things to spend your bells on. So it's only natural that you'd be focused on the money. And that's just the inherent call of the bells within the game. There's also external pressure of seeing your friends or internet strangers flashing their cash, YouTube guides that emphasize the need for bells, and also the basic human psychology of number goes up, brain gets happy. Of course, on release, you had to figure out how to make money by yourself. But even by the end of the first week, there were already a lot of guides available. So you had the option to just Google how to make money if you wanted to. But even if you chose not to, chances are you'd see someone online talking about something called Tarantula Island, or you'd ask a buddy how they got so many bells and they might send you a link to a YouTube tutorial. If you want to fully upgrade your house in New Horizons, the total you'll need comes to just under 9 million bells. That is a lot, so who could blame you for asking how can I speed this up and going to a guide for help? Early on, the go-to method was the Tarantula Island I mentioned. You'd go to a mystery island and if you were lucky, it would be Tarantula Island. Which is exactly what it sounds like. But if it wasn't, you could probably turn the island you ended up on into a tarantula island. And then you just catch a bunch of tarantulas and sell them for a lot of money. And that's great. Except the allure of the rising number meant that once I started doing that, it was all I was doing. There might have been ways to make money that were more fun. But if I wanted that number to go up as fast as possible, on the tarantula grind I would go. And when they eventually patched out Tarantula Island, I just moved on to the next best method. And on the surface, this is fine. The faster you gather bells, the sooner you can add more rooms, and you get all the fun of decorating them. But by using a guide to find out the best way to make money, I was changing the way I engaged with the game. If money is a key element of a game, then the economy is a key element of that game's world. And figuring out how that economy works is part of how you engage with the game. Going straight to a guide, there's less of a need to experiment with the economy. You skip out on the experience of catching a sunfish and thinking, wow, what a big guy, and realizing, actually, it's not worth that much. Or perhaps you wouldn't bother with the adrenaline of shaking trees to find a wasp's nest and frantically trying to catch them before they catch you. So eventually, I found I was barely engaging with the game at all, and certainly not in a satisfying way. I would load it up, I'd follow whatever money-making method was the current meta, and then I'd shut it off when I was done. I stopped interacting with my villagers, I stopped making fun designs, I stopped decorating my home, and eventually I got burned out. I know a lot of people got burned out on New Horizons, and I know to an extent it's just because the game's content ran out. But I wonder if that content would have run out a lot slower if I'd just gone guideless. Of course, using a guide doesn't force you to miss out on content. You can still engage with less lucrative parts of the game, even if you already know a more efficient way to make money. But it's hard to use an inferior method if you've already been shown the better way. On the other hand, if you were using a less effective method for ages and then discovered a better one later on, that's actually kind of fun, satisfying. Now, before I continue, I want to address my thoughts on game guides in general. It might come across that I don't think anyone should use guides or tips or tutorials or whatever, but that's not true at all. There's plenty of perfectly valid reasons why you might want to use a guide. And of course, absolutely any reason at all. It's your game, your time, it's often your money. You play how you want to play. My goal here is not to convince you the guides are bad. I'm just trying to share with you how going guideless might help you enjoy some games more. There's some obvious reasons why looking up a guide might spoil your experience with a game. If it's a game like Outer Wilds or Return of the Obra Dinn, where discovering the story is the game, then using a guide would be like having someone else play the game for you. But in a far more general sense, I've got two main reasons why going guideless has made games better for me. I call these the pillars of guidelessness. I made fun of myself for using the pillars in the last video, but they're back now, so I'm making fun of myself here again. The first of these pillars is the aha moment. Let's take a look. In Animal Crossing, using guides could mean missing out on discovering game mechanics, items, fun money-making methods for yourself. Say, chasing the banded dragonfly around and theorizing that if it's this hard to catch, it must be valuable. And then, when you go to cash it in, you're rewarded with an aha moment, when you find out that it was valuable. That is only a small part of Animal Crossing, but let's apply that logic to a game and a genre that has a lot of aha moments baked in. Deck building games are all about, are you sitting down for this? Building decks. You'll have a deck, usually cards, that do different things. Maybe one card does damage to your enemy, and maybe one card poisons them. But the thing most deck builders are designed around are synergies. Combining multiple cards or effects or whatever together to create something stronger. So you poison your enemy, and then you play a card that does more damage to enemies that have been poisoned. That's a basic synergy. Now, there's this game that owns a little piece of my soul called Balatro. Balatro? It's a deck building game based around the card game Big Two. Poker. In a round of Balatro, you make poker hands out of your deck. And after each round you can improve, copy, remove, or otherwise modify the cards in your deck, as well as acquire jokers which sit outside of your deck and have different effects. For example, the Even Steven Joker, which gives you more chips, your points, for every even-numbered card played. Now, for the sake of the non-Balatro players, I'm going to keep the details pretty light. And for you big Balatro heads, I know you've probably already paused the video to analyze the jokers, so I don't need to go into depth anyway. Balatro might seem complicated if you're looking at a playthrough that's already moving, but it's actually quite simple. Usually, you start out with nothing but a standard deck of 52 cards, and on the first round, you just make poker hands out of those until you score enough chips to move on. Then you enter the shop and you have a little money to spend and a couple of options to spend it on. Most of your options in Balatro are pretty simple. For example, you can upgrade 2 cards in your deck to give 30 extra chips, or you could pick up a joker that means all of your face cards give you bonus chips, or maybe you could just copy one of the cards in your deck. But it's because the options are so simple that Balatro leaves a massive amount of space open for creating synergies. So, turn a king into a bonus card with 30 extra chips, and then take the joker that makes your face cards give you extra chips, and then copy that king, and now you've got 2 cards in your deck that are giving you a ton of extra chips. And then you can take this even further to create incredibly complicated, machine-like synergies. Say, for example, you take a joker that makes every card count as a face card, so now every card is getting those extra chips. Combine that with a joker that turns all of your face cards into gold, which gives you money, and every card gets turned into gold. Add onto that a joker that makes all of your gold cards trigger twice. Add onto that a joker that gives you more points the more money you have. And I've veered into the nitty gritty of Balatro, but don't worry if you didn't understand all that. The point I'm trying to make is that you can combine the effects of your cards and your jokers, etc. to make complex, interlocking synergies that all start from simple modifiers. Now, let's tie this back to guides, because don't worry, I didn't forget that that's what this is all about. There's a lot of guides out there for Balatro. A pretty common response I've seen to people asking for help getting started in the game is watch Balatro University, which is a YouTube channel dedicated to Balatro and showing off its intricate mechanics. There's nothing wrong with looking up a guide if you're new to a game. I would never have gotten into Civilization if I hadn't used YouTube tutorials to learn how to play it. But one thing you'd really miss out on is the what if I moment that you would get from learning by playing. You see, figuring out how synergies work together is a lot like figuring out a puzzle. You could even argue that it is a puzzle. And if you Google the answer to a puzzle in a game like Professor Layton, that puzzle is solved for you. You miss out on the aha moment that you would get from solving it. In a very similar way, if you use a guide to find out that you can use the pareidolia joker with the smiley face joker to make every card give you extra points, you never get to connect those dots yourself for the satisfying aha when it works the way you thought it might. And yeah, I'm aware of the irony that I've now taken that aha moment away from you, but don't worry, that's one very obvious synergy. That's just scratching the surface. If you view Balatro's synergies like puzzles, then you can see why I found the game so much more fun by going in fresh and experimenting, repeatedly coming across fresh new ideas and discovering combinations that work together, sometimes in unexpected ways. It was a constant rush of me asking what if I, met with the dopamine of an aha, an entire experience that I might have missed out on if I were to watch guides on how to play the game first. Preserving this aha moment made a lot of other games more fun for me too. Experimenting with spells in Baldur's Gate, finding shortcuts in Neon White, and even in a very different way in Baratro, where our group discovered the hard way that pumping the reactor full of fuel rods doesn't mean more power, it just means more explosion. It wasn't exactly expert gameplay, but it made for a fun story. I could have used a guide to find out how to use the reactor properly, but instead, we all got to find out in a much funnier way. You can replay a game to re-experience the story and retry the levels, but you only get to discover them once. Now let's crack open that second pillar. Engagement. How you experience the world is also affected by your use of a guide. Your experience is altered if you come in with outside information, which in a way makes this a bit of a sub-pillar of discovery. Let's say you're sitting in front of your TV playing your Nintendo 64, you're directly engaged with the game, learning about the world and making decisions based on what's there in front of you. You and the character you're playing as are making decisions in tandem. But if we introduce a guide into the mix, suddenly there's a disruption to your engagement. You're adding a third party in between yourself and the game. Instead of finding out how an enemy works by getting attacked and learning how to fight back, you're instead just being told how it works. Finding your way around, learning about your enemies, learning about the economy, it's all part of how you engage with the game and with its world. Playing the game guideless means you get to experience that world as the character, not just as the player. In an extreme case, using a guide can remove your engagement with the game entirely. That's what happened to me with Final Fantasy IX. I wasn't just engaging with the guide more than the game, I was basically letting the guide play the game for me. But then, years later, after burning myself out on Animal Crossing New Horizons, I had a chat about it with a friend of mine who had done the same. And we came to the conclusion that we'd caused ourselves to burn out by just trying to get the most out of everything and looking everything up to do so. So after that, I decided to make a change to my relationship with guides, which for the most part meant going guideless. So to test out my new outlook, after almost a decade, I gave Final Fantasy IX another go. This time without using a guide at all. And I absolutely loved it. Now of course, going guideless meant I could choose my own equipment, figure out what skills worked well together and against which enemies, but it goes further than that even. Thing is, it's a story-based game, and using a guide won't change the story, but it does change how you, as the player, are positioned in that story. Let's take the opening scene with Vivi, for example. Vivi is a little wizard boy who's come to the big city of Alexandria for the first time. It's big and intimidating and not like anything Vivi has ever seen before, and as you guide him around, you'll get bumped into by city folk, you'll follow people because you know they're going where you're going, and you'll get a little bit lost. Your first experience with the city of Alexandria is much like Vivi's, and because of this, you're engaging with the world the way the character you're playing as is engaging with it. But if you were to follow the guide, it'll just tell you where to go and who to talk to. You can still talk to the city folk and explore, but you won't be doing it the same way Vivi is doing it. So, by going through the game without a guide, figuring out everything for myself, and discovering the world as I went, I connected with the characters more than I might have if I was using the guide. And this rippled out. I carried this successful experiment onto other games that I otherwise might not have enjoyed. In Persona 5, I spent my time talking to whatever characters I wanted to instead of just researching what would have benefited me most. And I made terribly inefficient machines in Satisfactory, which I then got to improve by myself. I spent 100 hours in Phasmophobia without understanding how any of the ghosts work, but that made the game spookier. I experienced these games for myself. Everything I learned from doing, and as a result, I had a far more engaging experience where I was an active participant in the world of those games. But of course, like I said, it's not a strict no guides policy. There's games that I might have ruined if I hadn't looked stuff up. Hollow Knight, for example, I got horrifically lost and I needed to Google to figure out where to go. And then as soon as I did, I loved the game. But I did free myself from the cycle of picking up a new game and just overusing guides because I was too afraid to get things wrong. And I think that is probably what it boils down to. Being too afraid to make mistakes, miss things, but that's probably a video in its own right. A quote I've seen brought up a lot, and one that I absolutely agree with, is given the opportunity, players will optimize the fun out of a game, from Civilization game designer Soren Johnson. And in this case, I was using guides to optimize mistakes out of my gameplay. But making mistakes isn't a waste, it's just part of playing a game. It's why you're given agency in the first place. so you can overcome a challenge and eventually get things right. So thanks to being a bit more sparing when it comes to using guides, I've taken a hobby I love and I found a way to enjoy it even more. Before writing this video, I texted my dad asking if he remembered giving me his old copy of Final Fantasy IX. And he said, yeah, great game. And I got to text him back that yeah, I agree, it is a great game.